The clock on the integrated kitchen range glowed an unforgiving digital blue. 3:17. Toe. This was not a time for domestic peace. It was the hour of quiet reckoning. A familiar window when the city was silenced and the deepest betrayals were most clearly audible. I was awake not from restlessness, but from a calculated vigilance that had become the unwelcome architecture of my new reality. For weeks I had measured his absences not in hours of missed sleep, but in the measurable metric of my own diminishing respect. My position in this glass-walled penthouse had subtly shifted from wife to meticulous observer. A silent auditor logging the evidence, Vance the man who believed he held the ledger. The sound that finally broke the silence wasn't the discreet turn of a key, but a triumphant, self-satisfied burst of laughter echoing up from the elevator bay aloud. Vulgar intrusion that seemed designed to announce not just his return, but his conquest. Victor didn't enter the room like a husband seeking shelter. He stormed in like a conqueror assessing his spoils. He was a tech executive, the supposed architect of a multi-million-dollar future. But tonight, he looked less like a visionary and more like a poorly executed caricature of entitlement. His suit, meticulously tailored charcoal wool, looked rumpled, a clear indication of a frantic, rushed end to a lengthy, leisurely indiscretion. The air that trailed him wasn't the clean proprietary scent of our high-end living. It was a noxious cocktail of expensive celebratory cigar smoke, cheap bar liquor, and a dizzyingly sweet, unfamiliar perfume. It was the scent of success mingled with disrespect, an aggressive fragrance that seemed to cling to his skin like a second brazen skin. He stopped in the foyer, catching sight of me. I stood perfectly still, illuminated by the distant glow of the city lights pouring in through the enormous floor-to-ceiling windows. I wore my heavy silk robe, its cool weight a comforting anchor against the tremor of my long-suppressed rage. There were no tears, no hysterics, and no outstretched arms waiting for a lie. My face was a study in cold, absolute neutrality, a discipline I had cultivated through years of high-stakes financial analysis. My eyes, usually warm, were now merely analytical instruments calculating the final, devastating equation of his failure. This wasn't the reaction he craved. He wanted the familiar, gratifying spectacle of a weeping, broken woman-eye display that would confirm his power and justify his need to seek excitement elsewhere. But he found only a wall of impenetrable, dead calm. He smirked, a slow, ugly pull of his lips that was worse than any shouted accusation. "Still up, Clara? Waiting for me. Were we? Don't waste your energy. Told you, my schedule is my own." I was out celebrating. Big win tonight. Huge. He paused, expecting me to rush forward to ask about the deal, to fall back into my prescribed role as the supportive, financially ignorant partner. I held my ground, the silence stretching taut between us. "You've gotten so dull, Clara," he continued, the words slurred with alcohol and dripping with condescension. "You're so static, so predictable. You've become my expensive wallpaper, haven't you? It's part of the background, a nice decoration that proves I can afford this place." The phrase landed not as a crushing blow, but as a clarifying signal. Expensive wallpaper. He didn't see me as a partner, a mind, or a threat. He saw me as a passive asset, a fixed piece of inventory tethered by co-signed mortgages and his illusion of control. The ambition, the intellectual curiosity, the formidable analytical training I had quietly shelved to play the role of the devoted, executive wife he had completely erased it. His assessment of my worth, reduced to a mere decorative expense, was the final critical error in his operational matrix. I watched him drop his bespoke jacket carelessly onto the polished marble floor. He didn't care about the stain it would leave, nor the expensive wine that would seep into the limestone. His indifference to everything but his own immediate, vulgar satisfaction was staggering. "Tonight," he boasted, leaning in close, forcing the aggressive foreign perfume into my space, "I was with someone who understands success, Someone who appreciates the hustle, the danger. Someone who reminds me I'm alive. It's a woman who is anything but wallpaper. He threw his keys carelessly onto the console table, the metallic clatter echoing his internal recklessness. Go back to sleep, Clara. Go back to your silence. It suits you. He was drowning in his own arrogance, completely oblivious to the fact that I had not been silent. I had been planning. My quiet was not weakness. It was the profound stillness of an analyst before a massive data dump. He thought the consigned mortgage kept me captive. Spay believed his wealth held the anchor. But in that moment, staring at his smug, victorious face, a cold, hard truth crystallized in my mind. He wasn't the anchor holding me down. He was the immense, corrosive debt I was silently carrying, and it was time to initiate the terminal phase of the asset liquidation. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply held his gaze, a slight, almost imperceptible shift occurring deep within my gray-green eyes. The look he mistook for despair was, in reality, the cold, dispassionate calculation of an auditor who has just found the single fatal flaw in a sprawling, fraudulent balance sheet. I let out a single, deep, silent breath, not of grief, but of absolute final severance. That breath was my official resignation from the role of the compliant wife and my official entry into the role of his executioner, Victor. Denied the gratifying spectacle of my tears, eventually shrugged off my silent dismissal as predictable. Exhaustion or the passive resistance of a woman beaten down by reality. He stumbled toward the kitchen, his posture radiating that lethal combination of Scotch-fueled confidence and the sheer, unearned entitlement of a man who genuinely believes the rules are written only for others. He poured himself a glass of water, splashing it clumsily over the black granite counter, heedless of the mess. He then began this self-congratulatory monologue, seemingly incapable of simply existing in silence. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to the expensive walls, rehearsing the narrative he needed to sustain his delusion. "It's not easy, Clara," he announced, his voice carrying the false profundity of the drunk. "Running a successful operation like Ethelred Tech, it takes sacrifice. It takes vision. It takes making difficult choices." He paused, looking down at the glass as if expecting the water itself to applaud his business acumen. "You wouldn't understand. Your world is safe, small, accounts payable, domestic budgets, comfortable numbers. My world, it's volatile, higher risk, higher reward. I deal with entities worth hundreds of millions. I deal with real power." He took a long, self-pitying sip of water, then added with a sickening faux sympathy, "And sometimes that means keeping secrets. Heavy secrets. Secrets that would terrify a small mind like yours." The contempt in his voice was undisguised. It wasn't just dismissal. It was an act of deliberate intellectual belittling, a calculated attempt to reduce my entire worth to the comfortable, decorative background he imagined. And yet this deluge of arrogance was exactly what I needed. His words weren't insults. They were unexpected critical data points. His constant boasting, his need to overstate the magnitude of his secrets wasn't for my benefit. It was a compulsion. A man who truly holds vast, untouchable power does not feel the need to broadcast the weight of his burdens to the wallpaper. His endless self-aggrandizement was, ironically, the clearest indication of his inherent instability. His status, the foundation of our entire life, was a construct built on the terrifyingly insecure bedrock of fear. I followed him wordlessly as he moved toward the enormous city window, his hand resting on the sleek glass pane as he gazed out at the indifferent grid of urban lights. I watched him not as a wife, but as a forensic analyst studying a volatile target. I saw the slight tremor in his hand, a twitch that wasn't solely attributable to the scotch. It spoke of exhaustion, but also of profound, unrelenting stress, the kind of stress that only comes from maintaining a lie of immense financial proportions. My own memories of the early years, the years when I had willingly stepped back from my demanding career in corporate financial auditing to support his ambitious, burgeoning company, rushed back. I remembered the long nights I spent crunching, His initial numbers, building his investor decks, tightening the budgets, the very scaffolding of Ethelred tech that he now pretended was exclusively his genius. I was his indispensable, uncredited co-founder, the silent architect of his solvency. Then, as his success ballooned and his ego inflated, he had gently, then firmly, ushered me toward the domestic sidelines, telling me it's time to focus on the lifestyle, Clara. Let the big boys handle the real numbers now. He didn't fire me. He marginalized me, fearing that my precise, relentless scrutiny would eventually expose the subtle, unethical corner-cutting that had fueled his rapid ascent. He turned from the window, his eyes catching Mina brief. Fleeting connection, he immediately broke with a dismissive wave. You know, the worst part about my life, the absolute hardest thing, is the sheer weight of the responsibility. I'm carrying all of this. All of it. The payroll, the investors, the future of the entire enterprise rests entirely on my shoulders. And when I come home, what do I find? Silence.com. Predictability, no fire, no drive. Just me. He gestured vaguely at me, the silk robe, the pristine apartment, a comfortable trap. A safe harbor that feels more like a gilded cage than a partnership. He was attempting to cast himself in the role of the tormented hero, the high-flying corporate genius burdened by a dull, predictable wife. He desperately wanted me to react, to defend myself, to cry, to scream that the silence was his fault, that the dullness was the result of his emotional abandonment. But I had long ago exhausted the capacity for such emotional expenditure. I had learned the lesson my own mother taught me through years of observation. A man who cheats doesn't need tears. He needs consequences he understands, delivered cold and clean. The consequences he understood were entirely financial: status, control, reputation. He worshipped the image of success more than success itself. If I struck at his heart, he would barely notice. If I struck at his wallet and his name, I would shatter his entire reality. That was the only language he spoke. That was the only pain that would register. And as he began to unbutton his expensive shirt, revealing the telltale shadow of lipstick near his collar, he made his next critical mistake, one born purely of his liquid-fueled overconfidence. He caught sight of my detached gaze focused on the lipstick smear. He actually laughed a harsh barking sound. Oh, the great detective has noticed the smudge. Good for you. What are you going to do about it, Clara? Send a passive-aggressive email. Change the bed sheets. Or maybe just keep counting pennies while I decide what color Porsche to buy next year? His mockery was deliberate, designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. He wanted a reaction he could crush. But instead of the pain he sought, he found only a sudden, profound clarity in my eyes, the cold, calculating certainty of a verdict already passed. I registered the crimson smear not as evidence of infidelity, but as evidence of his vulnerability. The color was a cheap, dramatic stain on a high-value acetostain. I was now ready to liquidate entirely. He was right about one thing. His world was high risk. But he was catastrophically wrong about who held the keys to the audit. I stood perfectly still, allowing his cruel laughter and the heavy scent of his transgression to wash over me. I gave him nothing. No defense, no accusation, no movement. This lack of reaction was my greatest weapon, a vacuum into which his arrogance poured and, finding no resistance, simply collapsed upon itself. He mistook my composure for apathy. He failed to realize that apathy is the final, irreversible stage of intellectual detachment. I wasn't hurt anymore. I was simply done in my mind. A clock was counting down, ticking not toward dawn, but toward the moment I would unleash the intricate, long-dormant mechanism of my professional expertise. Victor saw a dull wife in a silk robe. I saw myself through the lens of my former life, Clara Rhodes, one of the sharpest, most relentless forensic financial auditors in the region. Before Victor and Ethelred Tech consumed my life, I specialized in Black Swan events, the rare, catastrophic financial anomalies hidden deep within corporate structures that, when exposed, brought down seemingly unshakable enterprises. My expertise wasn't balancing a checkbook. It was tracing illicit capital flows across 5 continents, identifying phantom assets, and confirming the structural weaknesses in systems designed for maximum deception. And Victor, in his drunken, self-pitying confession, had just confirmed what my intuition had been screaming for months. He was running a Black Swan operation. He finally turned his back on me, convinced he had won the psychological skirmish. He headed toward the master bathroom, leaving the door ajar, another sign of his utter disregard for my presence. He began rattling around the medicine cabinet, the sound of glass on glass echoing faintly. He was searching, likely, for something to ward off the inevitable hangover. A temporary fix for a foundational problem. I finally moved. My feet glided silently across the cool marble floor, the softness of the robe muffling any sound. I walked not toward him, but toward my private study, a space he rarely entered, dismissing it as Clara's filing room. This room, with its high-security server and triple encrypted hard drives, was not a filing room. It was my command center, my intellectual fortress. For 5 years, I had maintained the illusion of domestic complacency, but I had never let my professional skills atrophy. I read the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal religiously, focusing not on the headlines Victor spouted, but on the footnotes and the regulatory changes. I maintained coded contact with 2 former colleagues in high-level compliance and network he didn't even know existed, believing my social circle was limited to other wives on the charity committee. I had maintained my certifications, taken online courses in emerging cryptology and AI-based audit trails, and kept my highly specialized software licenses current, paying for them out of my personal discrete investment accounts, which he, in his typical financial narcissism, had never bothered to scrutinize. He thought I was counting pennies. In reality, I was monitoring the global marketplace for the precise indicators of his inevitable crash, the shift in atmosphere. The moment I entered that study was palpable. The air was colder, drier, tinged with the scent of ozone from the equipment, the clean, metallic smell of absolute unyielding logic. I moved to my desk, a large expanse of unadorned glass, and gently placed my hand on the smooth, cold surface of the professional-grade server, the only piece of equipment in the house that was not connected to Victor's corporate network. Wallpaper, the word resonated with the sharp, cutting irony of his monumental miscalculation. He had spent years underestimating the woman who possessed the singular skill set required to dismantle his entire life. Asset by asset. He was a brilliant salesman, a charismatic CEO, but fundamentally, he was a gambler playing with stolen chips. I was the silent, methodical accountant who knew exactly how the casino counted its losses. My motivation was no longer just the sting of betrayal. It was the pursuit of justice, a cold, systemic dismantling of a fraudulent enterprise. The money he had amassed was built on lies that would eventually hurt innocent investors and employees. By exposing Victor, I wasn't simply getting revenge. I was stabilizing a volatile market risk and reclaiming my own professional integrity, which he had so carelessly discarded. This was about restoring dignity through definitive logical action. I sat down, flipping the switch on the hidden server. The faint, rhythmic worry sound was the most comforting noise I had heard all night. I opened a sterile, secure file titled Project Phoenix and began reviewing the documents. I had already passively collected over the last 3 months cryptic internal emails, vague meeting minutes, and most recently, the telltale pattern of aggressive, short-term borrowing disguised as long-term equity. Victor emerged from the bathroom, his face slightly pale, the scotch wearing off, replaced by the dull ache of a nascent migraine. He walked into the bedroom, not even glancing at my study door. He was entirely focused on the temporary relief of a sleeping pill and the vast, expensive mattress. "I need to be sharp tomorrow," he mumbled to the empty hallway, the sound barely carrying into my sanctuary. "Massive closing. We're finalizing this Series D funding. The valuation is going to send the stock through the roof." He yawned deeply, the sound heavy with self-importance. "Don't bother me before 11, Clara. I'll handle the money. You just handle the house." He thought that was the end of the conversation. He thought his final directive, handle the money. "You just handle the house," was the definitive reassertion of his dominance. He had just made the ultimate unforced error. He had provided the precise, high-stakes context series defunding that confirmed my analysis. The clock was no longer ticking towards dawn. It was ticking towards the closing of his greatest, most fraudulent deal and the simultaneous, spectacular collapse of his career. I reached for the burner laptop, a piece of anonymous, untraceable equipment I had kept updated for years, and began the first complex phase of the operation. I opened the encrypted file containing the 3 key pieces of information needed for the next step, setting the stage for the devastating financial exposure that would follow. Victor's downfall would not be a messy, emotional accident. It would be a precise surgical extraction of his worth, performed by the one person he was too arrogant to see, as the deep, rhythmic drone of Victor's sleep began to travel faintly through the heavy walls of the penthouse. I worked. The only light in the study came from the burner laptop screen, casting a cool, sterile glow across my face. It was the face of a professional engaging in the most complex, high-stakes project of her career. A career Victor believed had been permanently retired in favor of home decor and charity galas. The phrase Series D funding was the key I needed. It was the moment of maximum capital infusion and, therefore, maximum exposure for a company built on ambitious, unsustainable debt and opaque accounting practices. The influx of a final major funding round before an IPO was always the most heavily manipulated phase. It required massive, sudden adjustments to valuation metrics, often involving the temporary creation of phantom revenue streams or the obfuscation of systemic financial weakness. The urgency in Victor's voice meant this closing was not just a triumph. It was a desperate attempt to plug a cavernous, looming hole in his balance sheet before the regulators or a more skeptical institutional investor. Notice the I opened the document labeled Indicators of Instability. It contained 3 primary coded flags I had identified over the past months, each one pointing to a catastrophic vulnerability in Ethelred Tech's foundation. The Cyprus maneuver, a sudden, inexplicable surge in intellectual property licensing fees channeled through a holding company in Nicosia. This was the classic move to artificially inflate intangible assets on the balance sheet just before a major funding event. The delayed audit cycle, a consistent, deliberate pattern of pushing back the required external financial audits. A solvent clean company welcomes scrutiny. A fraudulent one runs from the calendar. The Venezuelan receivable, a bafflingly large account. Receivable from a shell entity in a politically and economically unstable nation. A clear sign of revenue being fabricated or parked to meet quarterly projections. Victor's hubris, his constant need to remind me of his superiority, had provided the context for these flags. He had once scoffed at my forensic specialization, dismissing it as boring details. The very details he scorned were the explosive charges I was setting. I began the meticulous process of cross-referencing the publicly available but poorly tracked corporate filings with the encrypted internal data I had managed to access through secure, non-attributable back channels, the fruit of my sustained, discreet professional network. I needed to move beyond suspicion. I needed to assemble a dossier so cold, so logical, and so legally irrefutable that no team of corporate defense attorneys could dismiss it as the emotional retaliation of a jealous wife. This had to be an anonymous professional execution, delivered with the terrifying finality of a terminal audit report. My mind was a whirlwind of complex calculations. But my hands were steady. I wasn't driven by the white-hot heat of anger, which would only lead to mistakes, but by the slow, burning efficiency of cold fire. Anger consumes the vessel. Cold fire consumes the target with surgical precision. My goal was not simply divorce. It was to ensure that Victor not only lost his wealth, but lost the very capacity to rebuild it. Permanent ban from the Tier 1 financial world he so desperately craved. The hours passed in a silent, methodical blur. The faint city glow began to shift from the deep midnight indigo to the pale nascent silver of pre-dawn. I could hear the distant, first tentative sounds of the city waking up a car horn. The faint rush of a subway, but I remained insulated in the clean, focused world of binary code and financial data. I had always known this moment would come. I had simply waited for the high water mark of Victor's arrogance. The moment when the pressure of his own lies forced him into a fatal, overconfident misstep. That moment had arrived when he proclaimed his financial independence and dismissed my entire existence as expensive wallpaper. I had confirmed his belief that I was incapable of understanding the complexity of his world, never suspecting that the complexity of his world was precisely what I was trained to dismantle. I pulled up the final piece of data I needed for the immediate strike. The list of institutional investors and the lead regulatory compliance officer assigned to the upcoming series Declosing. My plan was not to contact the media. That would be messy and unprofessional. My plan was to send an anonymous, perfectly structured package of preliminary evidence directly to the one person who could legally, instantly, and irrevocably stop the transaction and trigger a formal federal investigation, the SEC compliance officer Marcus Verano, a man known for his brutal, unwavering adherence to the letter of the law. I had the evidence. I had the target. All that was missing was the single, definitive piece of context that Victor, in his drunken triumph, was about to provide the final, concrete detail that would turn circumstantial data into irrefutable professional fraud. I closed the burner laptop, the screen going black, reflecting my own unreadable, determined face. I walked back toward the bedroom, pausing at the threshold. Victor lay on his back, his mouth slightly open, the deep, heavy snoring of the self-satisfied. His body looked large and vulnerable, but the sight stirred no pity in me, only a profound, cold sense of inevitability. I knew he would brag again when he woke. He would need to remind himself and me of his dominance. And that second final brag would be the pin I needed to pull the grenade. I turned away from the man who had traded his integrity for a fleeting sense of power. And I walked into the light of my new day. My transformation was complete. The compliant wife was gone, replaced by the methodical matriarch ready to execute her will. The sun climbed over the city, casting sharp, indifferent streaks of gold across the polished marble and glass of the penthouse. Victor finally stirred around 10:30 a.m., emerging from the bedroom not refreshed, but heavy, burdened by the double weight of alcohol and professional anxiety. He still carried the scent of his late-night indulgence, a faint, stale reminder of his arrogance, now mixed with the sour tang of morning regret. He was focused, however, not on the domestic scene, but on the crucial meeting ahead. The Series D funding was the lifeblood of Ethelred Tech. Its failure would mean not just a public setback, but a financial collapse that even his ego couldn't survive. He found me in the kitchen, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy sheath dress, quiet, composed, and sipping coffee, a vision of domestic perfection that he instantly misinterpreted as continued subservience. He wanted me to ask where he had been. He wanted me to display concern. Instead, I offered a calm, neutral acknowledgement. "Your meeting is at 2, Victor," I noted, my voice clear and utterly devoid of emotion. "I've left the itinerary on the counter. The car should be here precisely at 1:15 to avoid downtown traffic." My professionalism, the very organizational skill he once relied upon, now grated on him. He saw a machine, not a partner. And his pride demanded that he reassert his perceived intellectual superiority before facing the high-stakes table. He slammed his briefcase onto the counter, the sound sharp and aggressive. "Itinerary, coffee, car. Thank you, Clara. You're invaluable at these small details. But this isn't about logistics. This is about vision," he scoffed, pulling out his phone and immediately diving into the stock tickers. "Do you have any idea what's at stake here? This isn't one of your household budgets. This is $200 million in institutional capital. A single commitment that validates everything I have built. I looked at him calmly, setting my coffee cup down with a soft, decisive click. The valuation is certainly aggressive, Victor. $200 million for a company with persistent zero growth in its core service sector is ... challenging. The sudden professional terminology, the subtle insertion of an accurate, critical metric stopped him dead. The unexpected shift in my conversational register was palpable. His face tightened, a flash of genuine surprise momentarily displacing his characteristic smugness. He hadn't expected the wallpaper to speak the language of high finance. "What did you say?" His voice was sharp, edged with suspicion. I repeated it. Maintaining eye contact, the valuation requires a highly speculative growth projection in a sector where your closest competitors are struggling. That's not a secret. That's publicly available data from last quarter's industry reports. It begs the question, what's the real hook for this funding round? What's the $200 million actually buying? His suspicion instantly curdled into defensive anger. This was the moment I had anticipated. The intersection of his professional anxiety and his personal arrogance. He needed to prove I was irrelevant. The easiest way to do that was to over-explain the complexity of his power. "You want the truth, Clara? You want to know what separates me from your comfortable world?" He leaned in conspiratorially, his voice dropping, believing he was sharing a profound truth that would simultaneously crush me and elevate himself. The $200 million isn't just buying Ethelred tech. It's buying the data rights to the Chrysalis algorithm. That's the real secret. That's the real leverage. He paused, waiting for the expected blank stare, the uncomprehending nod of the domestic wife. I gave him neither. The Chrysalis algorithm, I repeated, testing the phrase. I knew the name. It was a nebulous internal project Victor had often mentioned in vague, self-important terms. The predictive behavioral modeling AI, the one that was supposedly still in beta testing? It's not in beta testing, Clara. It's been operational for 8 months. He declared, his voice a low, triumphant whisper. He was drunk on his own disclosure. And it works. It's the most sophisticated predictive model on the market. It's an absolute cash machine. But here's the key, the thing no one, especially not the regulators, can know before the deal closes. I didn't just license the rights. I never owned them in the first place. He let the heavy silence hang, the confession of massive, potentially criminal intellectual property theft delivered casually as an explanation of why I was irrelevant. His face was twisted in a grimace of dark pride, utterly convinced that sharing this staggering, highly sensitive detail would prove his untouchable status and cement my role as the ignorant wife. The Chrysalis algorithm, Victor continued, reveling in the moment, was developed by the team at Quantum Nexus Labs in Singapore, under a government grant. Their lead engineer, Dr. Lin, was a genius, but a fool. I promised him a position, a partnership, access to Western markets. And then I simply had my team file the intellectual property. Transfer papers through a series of shell companies controlled by the Cypress Holding, the same one you saw in the books. It was a clean, untraceable theft. The $200 million isn't buying an asset. It's buying silence and risk mitigation from the institutional investors who know the IP is stolen, but want the algorithm so badly they'll bury the evidence. He had just given me the unassailable, irrefutable core of his financial fraud, IP theft from a foreign government-funded entity, Quantum Nexus Labs, masked by the Cypress Holding Company, designed to justify the $200 million Series D valuation. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance. It was international fraud, a federal crime that would trigger not just the SEC, but the FBI and international compliance bodies. His casual disclosure, intended to humble me, was the sound of the final, fatal fuse being lit. I stood there, feeling the quiet, overwhelming satisfaction of the analyst whose theory has just been confirmed by the subject himself. I registered the 3 key data points. Quantum Nexus Labs, the victim. Dr. Lin, the witness, and IP theft, the crime. This was more than enough to turn my 3 indicators of instability into a full-blown federal case. Victor, mistaking my silence for "oh we," finally smiled a cold, self-satisfied flash of teeth. See, Clara? That's the difference. I deal with secrets that involve prison time and international espionage. You deal with which catering company to use for the Christmas party. That is why you are the wallpaper. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go secure my fortune. Don't wait up. He strode past me toward the elevator, his arrogance returning in full force. Leaving me alone in the sterile silence of the kitchen, he had committed the fatal error, not the infidelity, but the intellectual arrogance of confessing his crime to the one person in the world, uniquely qualified and professionally positioned to expose him. I did not move until the elevator doors closed, the faint ping marking the beginning of his final descent. I immediately went to my study. I didn't need to search through months of data. I only needed to connect the dots he had just handed me. I pulled up the encrypted file I had prepared the night before, now adding the definitive phrase: Chrysalis Algorithm Quantum Nexus Labs IP. Theft. This single addition transformed my preliminary dossier from circumstantial evidence of market manipulation into a smoking gun of fraud. The time for analysis was over. The time for action, the deployment of the Black Swan Strategy, was now. I accessed the secure, untraceable server, my fingers flying across the keys with the practiced efficiency of a former forensic auditor. I crafted an anonymous, highly professional communication, not addressed to a tabloid, but to Marcus Verano, lead compliance officer. Sec. The language was precise, cold, and factual, stripped of all emotional content, presenting only the financial matrix of deceit. I attached the encrypted, meticulously organized dossier and ensured the tracing headers were permanently scrubbed. The email's final sentence was my own personal verdict. Further investigation into the Quantum Nexus Labs IP transfer is highly recommended prior to the Series D closing. The risk of systemic financial contagion is 100%. I pressed send. The transaction was irreversible. The fuse was burning. The rest of the day was an exercise in theatrical normalcy. I attended a low-key charity luncheon, discussing foundation governance and endowment figures with the other wives, my mind simultaneously tracking the milliseconds until the sec would open the dossier. My outward composure was flawless, a shield so perfect Victor never saw through it. My internal focus, however, was a cold, high-frequency hum of anticipation. I knew Marcus Verano's reputation. He moved with the speed and precision of a predator when financial systems were threatened. He would not wait for a formal meeting. He would act on the initial, compelling evidence. I received the first confirmation shortly after 1 p.m. While sitting at a sun-drenched table discussing the minutiae of a school scholarship fund, it was not a call or an email, but a muted notification on my financial monitoring app. Ethel read: Tech stock trading volatility suddenly spikes to 450% above historical average. The market was reacting not yet to the news, but to the invisible disturbance I had initiated. The mere hint of regulatory scrutiny, the silent initial reaction of powerful insiders, was already destabilizing his perfect house of cards. Victor, completely unaware of the digital avalanche I had triggered, was likely on his way downtown rehearsing his triumphant, fraudulent pitch to the institutional investors. He would enter that opulent boardroom feeling invincible, believing his secret was safely locked away in the fortress of his arrogance. He would be completely blindsided by the invisible enemy already occupying the room. My confidence was not rooted in malice, but in mathematical certainty. I had identified the precise point of maximum leverage his IP theft hand, struck with the most lethal weapon available: cold, hard, federal compliance. This was justice delivered through the unyielding, logical structure of the financial system he had corrupted. The true satisfaction came not from the act of betrayal, but from the fact that Victor had authored his own downfall. He had gifted me the specific, specialized knowledge required to ruin him. Believing the words he spoke to the wallpaper were as disposable as the paper itself, he never considered that the wallpaper possessed the most sophisticated financial modeling software in the city and had maintained a network of compliance contacts that dwarfed his own superficial corporate connections. The silence that had previously defined my life, the silence he despised and dismissed, was now the profound silence preceding the financial explosion. My phone, safely tucked away, vibrated again at 2:05 p.m., 5 minutes after his Series D closing was scheduled to begin. It was a cryptic text message from my former compliance colleague, encrypted and brief. Black Swan spotted. Landing gear retracted. Containment procedures initiated. The code was clear. Marcus Verano and the SEC had received the dossier, confirmed the initial data points, and had moved to immediately halt the Series D transaction and freeze Ethelred Tech's current assets pending a full investigation. The $200 million lifeline had been severed. The ensuing chain of events would be swift and brutal. The institutional investors, alerted by the SEC's intervention, would execute their own risk mitigation strategies, pulling all remaining capital. The news would leak instantly through the closed financial networks, leading to a complete catastrophic crash of the stock. Victor's entire identity, built on the illusion of limitless wealth and untouchable status, would be vaporized in a single afternoon. This was not a tantrum. It was a systemic collapse engineered by the very person Victor had reduced to a piece of furniture. The man who scoffed at my small mind was about to learn that, sometimes, the quiet, meticulous details of a financial auditor can bring down a titan faster and more completely than any bomb. He had played a reckless game of high finance, and I, the silent matriarch, had simply introduced the final definitive balance sheet he could not contest. His own debt to reality. His crime was IP theft. His penalty was complete annihilation. The cost of calling me expensive wallpaper was about to be paid in full. The afternoon proceeded with a chilling, detached calm, the kind of stillness that blankets the eye of a hurricane. The charity luncheon concluded. I drove home through the bustling city traffic, an island of serenity amidst the chaos, knowing that miles away, in the austere glass towers of the financial district, Victor's reality was fracturing. The initial SEC intervention would have been met with furious denial, then escalating panic. Victor was excellent at charming investors, but utterly inept at navigating hostile regulatory audits. His arrogance would only accelerate his downfall. He was due home later than usual. I knew he wouldn't return triumphant. He would return furious, terrified, and grasping for an excuse scapegoat. And there, waiting patiently in the gilded cage he had designed, would be his wife, the silent wallpaper he had confessed his crime to. I used the quiet hours to finalize the second phase of my operation, the divorce filings. My lawyer, a brilliant, ruthlessly efficient woman specializing in high-net-worth fraud cases, had been waiting for the trigger event. The moment the SEC confirmed the investigation, my lawyer initiated the emergency filing. Our claim wasn't based on adultery, a messy, emotional distraction, but on financial endangerment and documented fraud. Victor's fraudulent activity was now on federal record, making his claims to marital assets voidable and establishing my right to a disproportionate split to compensate for the extreme financial risk he had imposed on me as a co-borrower and partner. His arrogance had not only cost him his company, but would cost him his equitable share of the marital estate. Reversing the leverage he believed he held over me, I prepared a light dinner, simple, clean meal for myself. I felt no hunger, only a profound cold sense of equilibrium restored. The years of quiet suffering, the slow corrosion of my dignity, had been transformed into this singular, decisive act of self-rescue. I wasn't doing this for revenge, but for the fundamental right to safety and integrity, both of which Victor had stolen. The phone rang at precisely 7:45 p.m. It wasn't Victor. It was my lawyer, Maya. Her voice was low, professional. and entirely without surprise. "Clara, I received the confirmation," she stated. "The SAC has issued a formal request for information and an immediate cease and desist order for the Series D closing. The language is severe. It specifically references unsubstantiated, intangible assets and international capital irregularities. This is the Black Swan event. The divorce papers are filed. I secured the emergency freeze on the primary brokerage accounts. He has access only to a minor operational account for basic expenses." "Excellent, Maya," I replied, my voice steady. "The evidence I sent Verano is irrefutable. We can expect him to return home soon, desperate and looking for a way out. He will not find one here. I want all communication channeled exclusively through you. I am no longer his wife. I am merely an interested party in the dissolution of assets. Understood? His counsel has already called me frantic and threatening. I advise them that the basis of our claim is the federal fraud investigation, not alimony. That shut them down immediately. You are safe, Clara. The law is finally on your side." The call ended. The knowledge that Victor was now trapped, his funds frozen, his company under federal lockdown, and his marriage dissolving on terms dictated by his own criminality. This was the deepest form of peace I had experienced in years. The house he had called his monument to success was now the clean, silent execution chamber of his ambition. I sat in the living room, the city lights twinkling beneath me, waiting for the final act of this calculated drama. Victor finally arrived at 9:15 p.m. I heard the elevator open. But there was no triumphant laughter, no aggressive slam of a briefcase. There was only a heavy, shuffling silence. He walked into the living room, a ghost in his expensive suit. His face was pale, slick with sweat, his eyes wide and unfocused, darting around the room as if expecting to find the enemy hiding in the shadows. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled. The veneer of the successful CEO had cracked, revealing the panicked fraud beneath. "Clara," he gasped, his voice raspy and thin, completely stripped of its former volume and arrogance. "You won't believe what happened. It's an ambush, a complete orchestrated attack. They froze everything. The SEC Verano himself was in the meeting. They stopped the Series D closing cold. They're claiming fraud, international IP fraud. It's a setup. Someone tipped them off with highly specific, damaging information." He looked at me, pleading, his eyes finally finding mine, searching not for comfort, but for a scapegoat, for a plan. He wanted me to be the wallpaper again, the silent, supportive background that would absorb his panic and help him rebuild his lies. "The chrysalis algorithm," I stated, my voice calm, flat, and chillingly precise. "The data rights you stole from Quantum Nexus Labs in Singapore, masked by the Cyprus Holding Company. That information, Victor, is irrefutable." His face drained of all color. He staggered back, leaning heavily against the glass wall. The realization hit him not as an accusation, but as a fatal, unarguable fact delivered by the one person he thought was too insignificant to matter. "You," he whispered, the single word a mix of horror, disbelief, and a dawning, shattering fear. "You heard me this morning. You used it." The wallpaper spoke. I rose slowly from the sofa, my posture radiating the cold authority of the matriarch. "You made a fatal error, Victor. Your infidelity was a moral failing. Your financial fraud was a crime. But your biggest mistake was believing that the woman you marginalized as a decoration lacked the intelligence, the skills, or the network to bring down your entire fraudulent empire. You confessed to a forensic auditor, thinking you were talking to an assistant." "I'm ruined," he choked out, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "The company is dead. I'm facing federal charges. I'll lose everything." "You've already lost everything, Victor." The moment you chose deceit over integrity, I corrected him. "I am not the woman who will wait up and cry. I am the woman who waited until you had the most to lose and struck with legal surgical precision. The mortgage is now a matter for my lawyer. You will deal exclusively with her. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. Consider the time you spent belittling me, the cost of your legal fees. He opened his mouth to protest, to beg, to scream, but the words died in his throat. He saw the cold, unyielding finality in my eyes, the profound indifference of someone who has already moved on. His world had collapsed, not from a random market crash, but from the simple, terrifying justice engineered by his expensive wallpaper. I turned my back on him, walking toward the study. The faint, clean scent of ozone from the server was a stark, purifying contrast to the fear and decay emanating from the man frozen in the living room. I didn't need to watch him fall. I only needed to ensure the door to my new free life was locked behind me. Victor was left frozen in the living room, a statue of terror, but his shock was rooted in a profound ignorance. He could not comprehend how the woman he saw as a mere decoration could possess the lethal, specialized knowledge to dismantle his empire. His question, "You used it," was the ultimate concession of his arrogance. A failure to understand that my quiet domesticity was the most elaborate camouflage I had ever deployed. This wasn't a sudden burst of vengeance. This was the methodical, years-long construction of a self-rescue vessel, built in the shadow of his contempt. The narrative must rewind to the genesis of the trap, to the moment I realized the lifestyle Victor had forced upon me was a gilded cage, and that my professional self, Clara Rhodes, Forensic Auditor, was the only key to freedom. This awareness hadn't dawned with his first infidelity. It crystallized the day he forced me out of Ethelred Tech's operational budget meetings, saying, "Darling, these numbers are too abstract for you. Just focus on the foundation, the domestic foundation." The irony was crushing. He wanted me to tend to the physical home while he systematically undermined the financial foundation of our entire life. I began my silent preparation 5 years ago, 3 months after our move into the penthouse. The first, most critical step was establishing absolute digital and financial compartmentalization. Victor relied on the illusion of shared access while maintaining exclusive control. I reversed this structure. I opened a separate, discrete, high-yield personal savings account, funded by liquidating old premarital investments he had forgotten existed. I labeled it Home Maintenance Fund in my personal Lajora details, so mundane he never once inquired. This fund was not for shopping. It was the seed money for my professional re-dash entry. Next came the creation of the sanctuary, the study he called my filing room. I installed the secure, segregated network physically distinct from the smart home system he bragged about. I ran private hardwired encryption lines and paid a former IT security colleague, Mark, a significant, discreet retainer to manage my external professional firewalls. Mark was an oracle in the world of non-attributable data access, and he taught me the subtle, ever-evolving tactics of corporate data leakage to digital breadcrumbs fraudsters inevitably leave behind. I understood that my biggest asset was not my technical skill, but Victor's absolute certainty of my incompetence. He bragged about his encrypted corporate communications. I learned how to monitor the subtle, nonverbal patterns of his digital life, a sudden shift in his use of specialized software, the specific times he initiated secure international conference calls, and the pattern of large, complex file transfers. These were not data points. They were the seismic tremors preceding a major financial quake. My quiet life became a highly specialized form of passive intelligence gathering. The charity luncheons he despised became my informal networking opportunities. While he saw me discussing floral arrangements, I was subtly confirming the reputations of his most aggressive new investors, gauging the political climate surrounding new SEC regulations, and most critically, identifying the best legal talent for high net worth fraud dissolution. Maya, my lawyer. I was embedding myself into the matrix of his world, not as a socialite, but as a stealth operative. My professional certifications, which Victor assumed had lapsed, were diligently maintained. Every 6 months, I traveled under the guise of visiting a distant relative. But in reality, I attended intensive, anonymous training seminars on new forensic techniques, blockchain tracing, AI data modeling integrity, and the legal nuances of international intellectual property theft paid for with my discreet home maintenance fund. I was not just catching up. I was specializing in the exact, sophisticated vulnerabilities Victor was beginning to exploit. The core of my trap lay in its patience and its objectivity. I didn't search for evidence of cheating. I searched for evidence of systemic existential risk to the company. Knowing that the former was a personal injury, but the latter was a legal weapon, I tracked his Cypress shell company long before he confessed the Chrysalis algorithm theft, simply because the timing and volume of the funds flowing through it were statistically aberrant for Ethelred Tech's declared revenue stream. I realized I wasn't just planning a divorce. I was planning a hostile corporate liquidation with a personal benefit. Victor's entire life was built on a calculated assumption of my weakness, and I had turned that assumption into the single greatest vulnerability of his $200 million empire. My silence wasn't fear. It was the meticulous loading of the perfect forensic payload, waiting for the moment of maximum destructive impact. The process of building the forensic dossier was an exercise in intellectual control and profound psychological patience. I understood that a fraudulent corporate structure is like a spider web. The core is strong, but the threads leading outward are weak and often repetitive. Victor, for all his alleged genius, relied on predictable patterns of deceit patterns I, as a trained auditor, could recognize instantly. I established 3 key monitoring protocols that ran autonomously in my hidden study. The Vendor Anomaly Log Val. This script constantly tracked Ethelred Tech's public expenditure reports, specifically flagging any sudden, unusually large payments to obscure, recently formed entities in higher-risk jurisdictions. The Cypress Holding Company initially registered as a low-risk outlier. Over months, as the intellectual property licensing fees ballooned, it became the primary focus, confirming the fraudulent nature of the IP acquisition. I had this log for 6 months, silently cataloging every inflated payment that helped prop up Victor's valuation. The digital proximity metric DPM. This was a subtle, highly technical monitoring of Victor's professional and personal social media use, cross-referenced with my discreet surveillance of his phone's international roaming logs. When he claimed a major technological breakthrough, I checked the DPM to see if any key personnel at Quantum Nexus Labs in Singapore had simultaneously disappeared from professional networks or suddenly changed their employment status. This confirmed the coercion and subsequent IP theft from Dr. Lin's team. The silent human cost of Victor's ambition. The Regulatory Watchlist RW. This was the most critical tool. It was a feed that aggregated every major SEC, DOJ, and international anti-money laundering regulation change. My goal wasn't just to expose him. It was to ensure I hit him with a newly enacted, stricter law that he was too arrogant and complacent to follow. I specialized in the laws of the coming quarter, not the current one. This ensured that when I struck, his legal defense team would be caught completely unprepared, defending against a regulation that Victor himself hadn't bothered to read. Victor was a creature of habit. He celebrated every perceived triumph by boasting, and he calmed every internal panic by seeking external validation, either through his mistress or by overstating his success. He thought I was blind to the world outside our penthouse. In reality, my world extended across secure digital networks, giving me an unparalleled view into the systemic rot of his company. My quiet life was the ultimate alibi. I had a reputation to uphold, the diligent, fashionable wife obsessed with charity and home life. This reputation was my armor. No one, especially not his colleagues or his shallow mistress, would ever believe that the source of the SEC leak was the matriarch who managed the seating chart for the annual gala. They would look for a disgruntled investor, a corporate rival, or a jilted business partner. The wallpaper was invisible. The final element of the trap was the personal sacrifice I made. To avoid any financial entanglement during the inevitable investigation, I aggressively paid off my share of the mortgage using my discreet fund, then silently restructured the asset ownership documentation with my lawyer. all under the cover of Victor's alleged business trips. I ensured that my own financial foundation was perfectly insulated and ethically clean. I was not just prepared to survive his collapse. I was prepared to capitalize on it, turning his fraudulent debt into my personal, unburdened asset. I waited patiently for the optimal moment, the Series D closing. That was the moment when his fraudulent valuation was at its absolute peak, maximizing his perceived wealth and, consequently, maximizing his fall. His desperate, drunken confession of the chrysalis algorithm theft was the final, unforced gift, the legal confirmation. I needed to finalize the SEC complaint and push the entire structure into terminal decline. The fact that he shared this secret with me, believing I was incapable of understanding its devastating implications, was the crowning achievement of my forensic trap. He never saw the matriarch hidden behind the silk robe, quietly building the case that would destroy him using the very logic he professed to worship. My approach was informed by the wisdom of my own professional lineage. During my years as a corporate auditor, I had observed that the most profound failures always stemmed from a toxic combination of arrogance and systemic complacency. Victor was the perfect specimen. He believed the complexity of his fraud was sufficient protection, never accounting for the simple, elemental truth: absolute power creates a blind spot. His blind spot was me. I never suffered from the illusion of a happy marriage. The partnership had been dissolved years ago, replaced by a cold, transactional arrangement where he provided the luxury and I provided the polished, socially acceptable facade. This emotional detachment was my greatest strength. I could observe him with the clinical indifference of a scientist studying a volatile compound. When he scoffed at me, I simply collected more data. When he boasted, I validated the source of his vulnerability. The intellectual satisfaction of building this trap was immense. It was the hardest puzzle of my career, one where the stakes were not just millions of dollars, but the reclamation of my own dignity and freedom. Every single element of my quiet life became a functional piece of the intelligence puzzle. The expensive cashmere sweaters he paid for allowed me to attend high-security financial conferences, where my attendance was noted by other attendees, but instantly dismissed as a spouse tagging along. The high-end private club memberships he insisted upon provided discreet, untraceable meeting locations for Maya and my former colleagues to review key documents. The elaborate, detailed organization of his travel schedules, a task he assigned to me to maintain my utility, provided me with the exact timing of his physical absence, allowing me clear, unmonitored access to my private study for extended periods. I built my entire defense on his offense. He wanted the world to see the powerful CEO with the compliant, beautiful wife. I gave the world that picture, knowing that behind the smile was a mind meticulously preparing the final corporate exit plan. The final psychological preparation was the hardest, maintaining absolute silence during his taunts and infidelity. I had to permanently extinguish the fire of emotional reaction and replace it with the cold, precise certainty of my professional judgment. The moment he called me expensive wallpaper, the emotional attachment died entirely. It became a pure business transaction. Victor had breached the contract of integrity, and I was exercising the termination clause with extreme prejudice. He had believed that the true power resided in his ability to create wealth through complex criminal manipulation. He never grasped that the true sustainable power lay in the ability to understand and enforce the unyielding rules of that system. He was the criminal mastermind. I was the chief investigator who wrote the protocols he broke. The result was the impeccable, legally sound dossier I had delivered to Marcus Verano. It was a document devoid of personal complaint, focused purely on the systemic financial destruction of IP fraud and market manipulation. It was so clean, so purely analytical, that Verano would have immediately recognized it as the work of a highly placed ethical financial professional. No jealous wife could produce a document referencing the Venezuelan receivable, and the digital proximity metric with such precision. Victor had dismissed the Matriarch. Now, the Matriarch had filed the final audit report on his life, and the verdict was total non-negotiable failure. The quiet life was over. The loud, demanding reign of justice had begun. Victor's world had fractured the moment. I pressed send on the anonymous SEC package, but the full, terrifying weight of the Black Swan strategy was still settling. The term Black Swan in finance refers to an unpredictable, high-impact event that, in retrospect, was entirely explainable and inevitable. My strategy ensured Victor's downfall wasn't viewed as a random market accident, but as a textbook corporate implosion triggered by an internal surgical strike. It was the perfect murder because the weapon was purely factual, the motive was legally sound, and the perpetrator was invisible. The core of the strategy was the simultaneity of the strike and the closing. By striking minutes before the $200 million Series D funding was finalized, I achieved maximum damage. If the funding had gone through, Victor would have had a massive cash reserve to fight the SEC investigation for years, dragging me through endless legal battles. By cutting off the capital flow at the source, I ensured he was insolvent, paralyzed, and defenseless the moment the investigation began. His own money, his supposed anchor, was immediately locked away. The first ripple of the Black Swan was not the official SEC announcement, but the internal market tremor. I've received real-time reports from my monitoring tools, tracking the proprietary trading platforms used by institutional investors. Within 30 minutes of the SEC's intervention in Victor's closing meeting, the algorithm, based on the anonymous data drop, began to calculate the risk. The result was a chilling, immediate market action. 3 major institutional holders, O'Fiddlard Tech stock, initiated massive, silent liquidation orders. This wasn't public news. It was the whispered language of the financial elite reacting to a perceived catastrophe. This immediate sell-off created a temporary, terrifying anomaly. The stock plunged not because of a lawsuit, but because the smart money had suddenly fled. This triggered the mandatory halt of trading, a safety mechanism that, in Victor's case, served as a public mark of shame. He was frozen financially, legally, and professionally by the actions of people he didn't even know, all based on a dossier created by the wife he ignored. The beauty of the audit as a weapon is its neutrality. My evidence was a narrative told exclusively through data. The Val vendor anomaly log demonstrated the cash drain through Cyprus. The DPM digital proximity metric linked the fabricated IP transfer directly to the victim, Dr. Lin, and the RW regulatory watch list confirmed Victor's deliberate violation of the new International Asset Verification Act, a law he dismissed as bureaucratic noise. The evidence was non-negotiable. Victor, trapped in the boardroom, would have initially resorted to bluster and denial. He would have faced Marcus Verano, the SEC compliance officer, with aggressive contempt. But Verano, a man immune to charm, would have simply pointed to the dossier, a document so forensic, so layered in its factual accuracy, that it could only have been generated by an insider who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. The complexity of the fraud was its weakness. It provided too many data points to track. I simply consolidated them into a single, undeniable conclusion. The psychological impact of this strategy was arguably more lethal than the financial one. Victor was not fighting a rival or a competitor. He was fighting a meticulously compiled, utterly objective data set. He was fighting his own spreadsheets. This realization that the system he bent and manipulated was now being wielded against him with greater precision would induce a paralyzing fear. He had been professionally assassinated by his own books. This cold, analytical execution was the culmination of my 5 years of quiet vigilance. I had waited for the moment when Victor's personal and professional liabilities were perfectly aligned, ensuring that when the Black Swan landed, it would leave nothing behind but the wreckage of his arrogance. The audit wasn't just murder. It was a public execution. Witnessed by the entire financial world he desperately sought to impress, the collapse unfolded with a chilling, self-propelled inevitability driven by the principles of financial fear and risk aversion. Once the Black Swan was confirmed, the SEC intervention and the stock halt the investors who hadn't liquidated. Their holdings moved to immediately distance themselves from Victor. The first public blow came not from the SE, but from the institutional fund manager, the Beaumont Group, who had been the most vocal proponent of Ethelred Tech. They issued a terse, non-apologetic statement announcing they were cutting all ties and initiating legal action to recover their initial investment, citing gross fraudulent misrepresentation of core company assets. This was not just a retraction. It was a public shaming delivered by his peers. The industry narrative instantly shifted from tech genius Victor to fallen fraudster. My lawyer, Maya, received the expected frantic communication from Victor's corporate counsel, threatening defamation lawsuits and demanding the source of the leak. Maya's response was a masterclass in legal coldness. She simply provided them with the legal filings for my divorce, citing financial endangerment due to the federal investigation into his IP theft and asset manipulation, by making the divorce about my personal financial safety from his crime and not his infidelity. I preemptively neutralized any attempt to paint me as a jealous, emotional spouse. The legal system was forced to view me as a victim of his fraud, not a perpetrator of revenge. The effect of this legal double tap was immediate and devastating. Victor was now under a federal gag order and simultaneously facing a financial lockdown imposed by the matrimonial court. He was legally silenced and financially starved at the moment he needed his resources the most. He couldn't access corporate funds for his defense, and his personal assets were under review. The Matriarch's will was executing itself through the seamless coordination of federal and civil law. I received a brief, encrypted message from Mark, my IT security specialist, who was monitoring the dark web chatter surrounding the initial collapse. The Quantum Nexus Labs engineers are preparing public statements. Dr. Lin is confirming the IP theft timeline. Your report is their proof. It's confirmed the ultimate lethality of the strategy. I hadn't just exposed Victor to the SE. I had empowered his original victims, providing them with the unassailable forensic evidence they needed to reclaim their technology and press their own charges. The Black Swan didn't just kill Victor's company, it resurrected the truth. I spent the rest of the day in a profound state of focused calm, preparing my own life for the inevitable scrutiny. I contacted the board of the primary charity I worked for, preemptively resigning my position. Not due to scandal, but citing immediate need to dedicate all professional resources to my personal financial defense against an external corporate fraud. I was managing the public narrative. Before Victor had a chance to spin his lies, my integrity remained intact, polished, and ready for my next professional chapter. The sound of my phone ringing was the final, inevitable confirmation. A harsh, loud, unlisted number. It was Victor. I let the phone ring once, twice, then simply silenced it, placing it face down on the clean glass table. I did not need to hear his pleas, his threats, or his curses. His words were irrelevant now. His fate had been sealed by his own ambition and the meticulous logic of the audit. He had played a reckless game, and the silent, patient auditor had delivered the final, undeniable, cold verdict. The perfect murder was complete. The silence that followed the phone call was heavier and more profound than any silence before. It was the absolute void left behind by Victor's extinguished career. I understood that the term perfect murder in this context meant the complete and clean professional erasure of the target, without leaving any attributable blood or emotional residue. The method was pure logic, and the outcome was absolute justice. The subsequent media reports, which began trickling in late that evening, followed the exact trajectory I had predicted. The articles were less about the fraud itself and more about the stunning speed of the collapse. They spoke of the unprecedented coordination between the SE, international regulators, and the civil court, painting a picture of an investigation that had clearly been years in the making, never once suspecting that the years referred to the careful, hidden preparations of a single determined individual. The matriarch's invisibility was her greatest protection. I thought about Victor, slightly holed up with his lawyers, trying desperately to find a loophole in the perfectly sealed legal trap. He would be frantically searching for the source of the leak, convinced it was a high-level rival or a mole on his board. The idea that his own wife, the expensive Wallpaper, possessed the specific technical expertise to not only understand his crime, but to weaponize it, would remain an incomprehensible truth to him. A fundamental failure of his entire arrogant worldview. The cost of his arrogance, I realized, was not just the $200 million valuation he lost, but the permanent unrecoverable loss of his reputation and his capacity for trust. No Tier 1 investor would ever fund him again. No major corporate board would risk associating with a name synonymous with SEC, lockdown, and international IP theft. The Black Swan Strategy had ensured that Victor was not just ruined. He was exiled from the very financial world that defined his identity. I opened a bottle of vintage champagne, not for celebration, but for the quiet, solitary acknowledgement of a mission executed with excellence. I raised the glass to the silent, dark city skyline, acknowledging the thousands of hours spent in my study, maintaining my skills, and constructing the flawless, lethal data package. This was not revenge. This was the restoration of balance. The matriarch's will was clear. Integrity is the only sustainable asset. Victor had traded his integrity for a fleeting moment of dominance, and the market, through my precise intervention, had now demanded the final brutal payment. My future was clear, unburdened, and entirely my own. His future was defined by the relentless, cold pursuit of the law. He thought he was above, that the air in the penthouse was thick with the suffocating silence of a disaster already completed. Victor, having spent a night alternating between desperate, unanswered calls to his frozen corporate accounts and furious, paranoid pacing, finally collapsed into a restless, anxious sleep on the living room sofa. He had ignored my order to vacate, clinging to the physical space as if the granite and glass could somehow protect him from the legal storm raging outside. He woke abruptly at 7 a.m., not by an alarm, but by the frantic, insistent ringing of his secured corporate line, a number reserved exclusively for high-priority business and institutional contacts. The ringtone, usually a calm, low chime of confidence, now sounded like a catastrophic warning siren. He lunged for the phone, his body sluggish with fatigue and adrenaline, the silk of the sofa sticking uncomfortably to his sweaty skin. The caller ID flashed a name that instantly turned his stomach into a knot of cold dread. Evelyn Reed, Chief Legal Counsel, Beaumont Group, the very institutional investor who had publicly severed ties the day before. Victor scrambled to adopt his usual veneer of calm aggression. Evelyn, to what do I owe this early call? I trust your team. As he was cut off abruptly, the silence on her end replaced by a voice that was pure, cutting professional ice, devoid of any past courtesy. Save the performance, Victor. Your team is irrelevant. I called you for one reason, to inform you that the Beaumont Group has successfully executed the recovery clause on all outstanding principal loans. Your collaterals, specifically the patents related to your core service sector, has been legally seized and transferred to our holding entity as of 6 a.m. this morning. Victor sat bolt upright, the remnants of sleep instantly incinerated by pure terror. Seized? On what grounds? That collateral was not subject to the general recovery clause. That's insane. We had separate documentation. We now have an unimpeachable legal basis, Victor, Evelyn retorted, her voice hard as granite. The discovery phase of our internal audit confirmed the initial anonymous reports of systemic fraud and IP theft related to the Chrysalis algorithm. She didn't pause for breath. More urgently, Marcus Verano from the SE is attempting to contact you. His office has been on the phone with us since 5:30 a.m. He is not calling to negotiate. He has a federal search warrant and a subpoena for your personal and corporate records. He is currently waiting for you to pick up. Victor, the SEC is on line 1, and I strongly advise you to answer it. This call is logged and concluded." The line went dead, leaving Victor holding a device that felt suddenly heavy, cold, and useless. His meticulously constructed world had just shrunk to a single, terrifying truth. He was not a successful CEO navigating a crisis. He was a target of a federal investigation already financially dismembered before his first cup of coffee. The Black Swan Strategy had ensured the legal consequences arrived first, fast and simultaneously from both civil and federal fronts. He stared at the phone, sweat beading on his forehead. The Beaumont Group had not just left, they had actively stripped him of his foundational patents, ensuring that even if he somehow survived the SEC, his company would be a hollow, worthless shell. The seizure wasn't revenge. It was the cold capitalist cleanup of a toxic asset. His attention snapped to his personal phone, which had been buzzing with calls from unlisted numbers since the pre-dawn hours. He saw the text message that had also come through, a short official notification from his bank. Access to all joint and primary savings accounts restricted pending further legal review. Contact Ms. Maya Chen for details regarding the emergency marital asset freeze. The ground truly gave way. Maya Chen, my lawyer. The asset freeze wasn't a corporate maneuver. It was a devastating personal strike initiated by his expensive wallpaper. He realized the terrifying coordination. The SEC was hunting him professionally, and Clara was starving him financially, ensuring he had no war chest for his defense. Panic, cold and suffocating, finally took hold. Victor snatched his corporate phone, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He returned the last missed call from the number Adeline Reyes had referenced. It rang only once before a voice answered, a calm, deep baritone that carried the weight of institutional authority. "This is Agent Verano, Securities and Exchange Commission." Victor immediately launched into a frantic defense, reverting to his salesman persona, desperate to charm or manipulate the authority figure. "Agent Verano, this is Victor Vance, I assure you. This is all a massive misunderstanding, a highly malicious attack by a disgruntled former client. Ethelred Tech is entirely compliant. Our books are open, sir. Your books, Mr. Vance, are currently frozen by a court order filed this morning." Verano stated, the calm tone more menacing than any shout. "And based on the preliminary forensic analysis of the anonymous report we received, your claim of compliance is highly dubious. We are not interested in your excuses. We are interested in your cooperation." "Cooperation? What exactly are you looking for?" Victor demanded, his voice cracking with fear. He could hear the heavy scrape of a chair and the rustle of papers on Verano's, and the sound of his life being filed away as evidence. "We are looking for the original intellectual property transfer documents related to the Chrysalis algorithm. From Quantum Nexus Labs," Verano replied, his voice accelerating its pace, listing the precise details Victor had confessed to me. "We are looking for evidence of the money laundering protocol initiated through your Cyprus holding entity, specifically the transactions over the last 12 months that violate the International Asset Verification Act. And we are looking for the names of the individuals involved in the fraudulent inflation of your Series D valuation." Victor felt the world spinning. The level of detail was impossible. Verano wasn't fishing. He had the full script. He had the complete, irrefutable map of Victor's professional crimes, a map I had drawn based on Victor's own arrogant words. That information that's all privileged. No one could have accessed that without a highly skilled forensic auditor gaining access to critical internal data. Verano finished for him, the question hanging like a guillotine. "We don't speculate, Mr. Vance. We deal in facts. And the facts show that a significant portion of your company's declared valuation is based on stolen intellectual property. That is federal securities fraud, Mr. Vance. You are now a person of interest in a criminal investigation." "But who gave you this? Who is behind this ambush?" Victor pleaded, his voice reduced to a desperate whine. He desperately needed a physical enemy to fight, someone he could threaten or bribe. Verano paused, the only sign of human inflection, a low professional sigh. The source of the tip is immaterial, Mr. Vance. The veracity of the evidence is absolute. And I suggest you stop referring to this as an ambush and start referring to it as the consequences of your deliberate criminal actions. I have excellent corporate counsel. They'll fight this. They'll sue. Your corporate counsel has already advised my office that they are receding from their representation due to the severity of the charges and the risk of collateral investigation, Freno informed him, delivering the final crushing blow. And as for the excellent divorce lawyer you may hire, they will find that all of your liquid marital assets are currently frozen and subject to distribution based on the claims of financial endangerment. Filed by Ms. Clara Rhodes. The call ended shortly thereafter, concluding with Verano's cold, unyielding instructions regarding the immediate seizure of Victor's corporate devices and his mandatory appearance before a federal magistrate. Victor dropped the phone onto the carpet, the sound muffled and insignificant in the vast, echoing space of the penthouse. He sat there, staring at the floor, the full weight of the Matriarch's strategy settling upon him. The Black Swan was not a singular event. It was a coordinated, three-pronged attack. The professional kill, the SCE, armed with my dossier, had destroyed his company and his reputation, making him unemployable. The financial starvation, Maya Chen, my lawyer, had simultaneously used the SEC investigation as grounds to freeze his personal wealth, ensuring he couldn't afford a high-caliber legal defense. The personal annihilation, the realization that Clara, his wallpaper, was the mastermind, had shattered his confidence and exposed his monumental failure of judgment. He finally stood, his movements slow and clumsy. He walked into the kitchen, his eyes falling on the smooth granite counter, where, less than 24 hours earlier, he had gloated about his $200 million secret, dismissing me in the process. He saw the emptiness of his coffee cup, the sharp, clean lines of the appliances, the very definition of the safe, predictable domesticity he had despised. Now, that predictability felt like a profound, unreachable comfort. He walked to the window, gazing out at the magnificent, indifferent city that had celebrated his rise and was now witnessing his quiet, humiliating fall. He no longer saw a city of opportunity. He saw a skyline populated by the financial institutions and compliance officers, who were dissecting his failure piece by piece. He saw my coat hanging neatly on the closet door, simple, charcoal wool coat, perfectly tailored. It looked expensive, but it looked purposeful, ready for a life outside these walls. He realized I was not packing. I was moving on, transitioning from the role of the wife to the role of the free woman. He remembered my final instruction. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. The clock was ticking. He had lost his job, his wealth, his reputation, and now he had lost his home. All because he confused silence with helplessness and believed his own arrogance was a better shield than integrity. He took a shaky step toward the bedroom, only to be stopped by the faint, insistent ringing of his phone. It was an unlisted number. He didn't need to answer it to know. The media had caught the scent. The public humiliation was about to begin. He was alone, broke, and targeted, and the woman who loved him was gone, replaced by the matriarch who had delivered the final non-negotiable verdict of his cold, complete annihilation. He sank to his knees on the cold marble floor, the silence of the penthouse amplifying his absolute ruin. The morning call was over. The long, terrifying descent into consequences had just begun. Victor's descent into professional ruin was agonizing, but the subsequent personal humiliation was delivered with the swift, brutal efficiency of a market correction. He had always relied on external validation, the applause of investors, the envy of colleagues, and, most critically, the superficial adoration of the woman he called his escape, his fire. His platinum mistress, Sasha. Sasha was a young, ambitious social media strategist who valued Victor not for his personality, but for his projected net worth and the access his status provided. She was the living embodiment of the luxury and excitement he believed. I lacked, clinging to the remnants of his shattered reality. Victor's first instinct after the SEC call was not to call his lawyer, but to call Sasha. He needed comfort, belief, and the immediate, emotional rescue only his fire could provide. He needed her to confirm that his genius transcended his current legal woes, that his value was intrinsic, not just financial. He found an isolated corner of the penthouse, a spot where he hoped the SEC might not be listening, and dialed her number, struggling to control the desperate tremor in his voice. "Sasha, it's Victor. Look, I need you. Something catastrophic has happened. It's a crisis, a setup. The SEC froze everything. My company, it's under siege." He tried to project a tone of controlled urgency, but it came out as a ragged, terrified whisper. On the other end of the line, Sasha's voice was instantly cool, the initial warmth replaced by a sharp, calculating distance. "Victor, the SC. What are you talking about? I just saw the news flash Sil Red Tech stock halted, alleged international IP fraud. Victor, that's not a crisis. That's a felony." Her immediate knowledge of the specific damaging details proved that she was not just reading the gossip. She was monitoring the market fluctuations that directly affected her own parasitic investment in his life. She wasn't just his mistress. She was a mercenary. It's temporary, Sasha. A legal skirmish. I'll bounce back. I'm Victor Vance. I'm a visionary. I just need a place to regroup. My wife, Clara. She's freezing my accounts and trying to sell the penthouse. I need to come to you tonight. The silence on the line was long, clinical, and utterly devoid of pity. It was the sound of a profit margin being reassessed and found wanting. "Your wife is selling the penthouse." Sasha finally asked, her voice incredulous, a tremor of genuine annoyance beneath the veneer. "Victor, that's your anchor. That's half your collateral. I need you to believe in me, Sasha. I bought you the vintage watch in Geneva, the trips, the apartment deposit. We had a future. You said I was your alpha male, the one with real power." Her response was chillingly swift, a definitive corporate rejection. "Victor, let's be honest about the future. The future was contingent on the present being stable, predictable, and funded. You were the successful CEO, not a federally investigated felon facing insolvency. I'm a strategist, Victor. I value stability. And right now, you are the definition of a toxic liability." She didn't miss a beat, cutting through his desperate pleas with merciless clarity. "Your power was the illusion of untouchable status. That illusion is shattered. Your wealth is frozen. Your reputation is poison. You are now exactly what you tried to escape, a financial risk." The emotional starvation delivered by Sasha was the final, critical confirmation for Victor. His entire existence was transactional. He had dismissed my loyalty and depth as boring. He had chased Sasha's superficial excitement, only to find that her interest was shallower and more conditional than any corporate contract he had ever signed. The very moment his monetary value disappeared, so did the love he had purchased. "But the gifts, Sasha. The apartment. I've spent hundreds of thousands to ensure your comfort," he pleaded, clinging to the only currency he thought mattered. Sasha's reply was brutal, cold-blooded accounting of their relationship. "The gifts were a retainer, Victor. They were the cost of my time and my discretion. They were insurance, and the policy has just expired." Her voice grew sharper, impatience replacing calculation. "You think I want my high-end neighbors seeing an FBI target slinking out of my building? A man whose name is being dragged through the financial columns as a fraudster. That destroys my brand, Victor. You lost your status. Therefore, you lost your access. It's simple market dynamics." She was right. She spoke the language of the ruthless marketplace he pretended to rule. She was simply a younger, more honest reflection of his own avarice. The true irony was that the platinum mistress he thought possessed fire and drive was simply a meticulous, self-interested accountant of her own worth, a cold pragmatist, much like the wife he had discarded. Don't call me again, Victor. You're messy, and I don't do messy, she concluded, delivering the final, definitive rejection. The sound of the line clicking dead was sharper and more final than any corporate termination notice. It was the complete personal annihilation of his self-worth. Victor slumped back against the marble, the phone slipping from his grasp. He didn't just feel rejected, he felt utterly exposed. Sasha, the woman he chose over his marriage, had confirmed every terrible truth he was running from. He was not loved. He was rented. And his rent was now overdue. The Black Swan Strategy had not just hit his company. It had revealed the fraudulent nature of his entire personal ecosystem. This emotional void was exactly what I had predicted. I knew that without his status, the high-octane fuel for his ego, he would have nowhere to turn. The Platinum Mistress was designed to collapse the moment the financial foundation was removed. Victor spent the rest of the day in a profound state of isolation, alternating between denial and pathetic bursts of rage. He called the number again, only to find Sasha had blocked him entirely. He attempted to contact his old circle of friends and associates, those who had dined with him and accepted his lavish favors. The calls went unanswered, the text messages unreturned. The financial world is a network built on mutual benefit and risk avoidance, and Victor was now the ultimate risk. He was toxic. The speed of his social exile was stunning. He was accustomed to a life where his money bought him access, silence, and adoration. Now, his disgrace was infectious. No one wanted their name associated with a federal fraud investigation. His supposed friends were simply protecting their own brands and wallets, just as Sasha had done. The man who saw me as wallpaper was now invisible to the world. He walked through the penthouse, the silence of the vast, echoing rooms amplifying his ruin. He saw the empty spaces where his confidence used to reside. He looked at the expensive objects, the artwork, the imported furniture, the panoramic view, and realized none of it belonged to him anymore. It was all collateral, subject to the disposition of the court and the cold, unyielding will of the woman he had dismissed. The emotional core of my strategy was not to make him suffer, but to force him into complete, inescapable clarity. He had to understand that his downfall was not a random ambush, but the direct, inevitable consequence of his own choices. The loss of Sasha was not a heartbreak. It was the final, definitive accounting of his transactional life. He was worth exactly what he could pay, and his balance was now zero. That evening, I returned to the penthouse briefly to collect the last of my essential professional documents from the study. I found Victor in the living room, still slumped on the sofa, still wearing the rumpled suit from the day before. He looked physically smaller, defeated. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow. "You won," he rasped, the words thick with shame and a terrifying dawning realization. "You didn't just take the money. You took everything. I have nothing left." I didn't pause. I didn't offer comfort or a final monologue. My only response was the steady clinical finality of the Matriarch. "You were given every opportunity to build a life of integrity, Victor. You chose fraud and you chose arrogance. Now, you must face the consequences of both." I turned, walked into my study, and emerged 2 minutes later with my briefcase. I closed the front door behind me softly, definitively, and locked it. He was alone in the gilded cage. The Platinum Mistress had fled. The sec was closing in, and the Matriarch was free. His worth had indeed plunged to zero. The cold, hard slap of Sasha's rejection was merely the sound of a personal transaction ending. The deeper, more crippling blow to Victor's identity was the subsequent institutional silence, the chilling refusal of the professional world to acknowledge his existence. Victor, desperate, isolated, and legally starved, understood that his only chance was to secure a high-caliber legal team, and failing that, to secure a any job that would provide the income required to fight the SEC and Maya's divorce claim. He needed to prove he was still the financial shark he always claimed to be. He spent the first 72 hours following my departure in a feverish, futile attempt to secure legal counsel. He called the most expensive, most aggressive corporate defense firms, believing his name and the sheer complexity of his case would compel their attention. The responses were not refusals. They were clinical rejections wrapped in professional distance. The first major firm specializing in white-collar defense responded to his frantic email not with a call, but with a terse, digitized message from an associate attorney, Mr. Vance. We have conducted an initial conflict check and reviewed the public filings regarding the Evelyn Tech matter. Our firm's governance board has determined that the potential exposure to international regulatory risk, particularly concerning the International Asset Verification Act violations, is outside our firm's acceptable risk parameters. We wish you luck in securing alternative counsel. The language was devastatingly precise. They didn't decline due to cost. They declined due to risk parameters. Victor was not a client. He was a contagion. His case was too toxic, too politically hot, and too financially tainted to be worth their time or reputation. This was the core of the Black Swan Strategy. Ensure the evidence is so irrefutable and the legal threat so comprehensive that even the legal mercenaries flee. By simultaneously hitting him with the SEC, IP theft claims, and the civil asset freeze, I had made his professional survival economically unviable for anyone else. The humiliation deepened when he attempted to contact his former high-level associates, the partners, investors, and CEOs he used to dominate at lavish corporate events. He didn't ask for money. He asked for a single, small professional courtesy, a meeting, a referral, a lifeline. The replies were either non-existent or delivered by intermediaries and scene gatekeepers whose job it was to filter out professional decay. One former partner, a man Victor had mentored and funded, sent a particularly cruel, calculated email. Victor, I understand you're navigating a difficult time. However, my firm's focus is on compliance and clean growth until the federal matter is definitively resolved. Any association, even a courtesy phone call, would violate our ethical partnership clause. You need to deal with your situation privately. Ethical partnership clause. The phrase was a dagger. Victor had always scoffed at ethics, viewing them as a weakness. Now ethics were the unyielding, impenetrable wall that locked him out of the financial kingdom he coveted. His entire world was built on the premise that money trumped morality. Now, the market itself was signaling that his lack of morality had rendered his money permanently untouchable, unable to secure legal or professional help, and now officially homeless as per my deadline. Victor was forced into a pathetic, desperate scramble for survival. He needed a job, anything, to show the court he was capable of earning an income and therefore worthy of receiving some share of the frozen marital assets. He started small, applying for mid-level financial analysis positions, jobs he would have laughed at just months before. His resume, once a powerful weapon, was now a liability. It screamed former CEO of federally investigated company. The response rate was 0. He called his closest former ally, Arthur, the CFO of a competing tech firm, a man Victor had saved from bankruptcy years ago. Victor believed this was a debt of loyalty that could not be refused. Arthur, however, was a master of self-preservation. When Victor finally reached him after 10 attempts, the voice on the line was clipped, nervous, and entirely professional. Victor, look, I can't talk long. My team is monitoring this call. You know the environment we're in, Arthur. I saved your company. I need a temporary position, something I can do remotely. Just a consulting gig. I need to show the court I'm not destitute. Victor pleaded, the desperation in his voice shattering his last shred of dignity. I owe you a personal debt, Victor. I grant you that, Arthur admitted, his voice low. But my firm operates under stringent Tier 1 ethical standards. The moment the SEC filed against Evelyn Tech, your name became a non-starter. Our compliance office flagged your professional history as a catastrophic reputational risk. It's nothing personal, Victor. It's just the fiduciary reality. Fiduciary reality. I saved your job. I put food on your table, and I appreciate that. But my firm's legal mandate is to protect our brand from contamination," Arthur stated, his voice hardening, becoming the mouthpiece of the cold, impersonal institution. We conducted a final review, and the official conclusion is simple. Victor, the firm has no ethical standards for you. Not because we hate you, but because maintaining our standards means we absolutely cannot associate with a name-facing IP theft and market manipulation charges. If I hire you, I risk my own license, my firm's compliance rating, and potentially invite sex scrutiny into my books. I won't do it." The line went silent for a moment, the implication hanging in the air like a death sentence. Arthur was choosing institutional safety over personal loyalty, the most rational decision in the cold world of high finance. "Okay, I can arrange for a modest, anonymous personal donation to a charity in your name." Victor Arthur offered the gesture a final, insulting confirmation of his status as a pariah. "But the professional door is closed permanently. You need to understand this. You didn't just fail. You became toxic." The conversation with Arthur marked the final stage of Victor's professional execution. He was not just fired. He was professionally excommunicated. He realized that the Matriarch's strategy had been flawless. She hadn't needed to win every court battle. She only needed to ensure he was stripped of the means to fight back his money, his reputation, and his professional network. Homeless, alone, and universally blacklisted, Victor was forced to face the stark, humiliating reality of my divorce strategy. Without income, he was legally powerless to contest my claims. The court would view him as an unemployed felon in waiting, while I, the clean, steady financial professional, would be viewed as the responsible, endangered party. My path to a majority asset distribution was now clear, secured not by spite, but by his own professional decay. Victor had nowhere left to go. The penthouse was sold. Sasha was gone. His friends were silent. He was forced to seek refuge in the last, most painful place imaginable, the home of his distant, judgmental sister Eleanor, who lived 2 hours outside the city. Far from the gleaming towers of his former life, he arrived at Eleanor's humble suburban home carrying 2 worn suitcases, a defeated middle-aged man stripped of his defining characteristic wealth. Eleanor, a quiet woman who had long viewed Victor's aggressive corporate life with suspicion, greeted him with a mixture of pity and severe disapproval. "Victor," she stated, her voice quiet but firm, "I will give you shelter, but only on my terms. This house is built on honesty and quiet work. You are welcome here only if you understand that the lies of your previous life are not welcome here." His humiliation was complete. He was reduced to accepting the charity of a relative he had ignored for years under the condition of moral surveillance. The man who had boasted of international deals and $200 million valuations was now dependent on his sister's goodwill and forced to live by ethical standards he had spent his entire career mocking. He finally understood the matriarch's verdict. I hadn't sought to wound him. I sought to expose him to himself. I had simply held a mirror up to his corrupt life. The system he worshipped had delivered the final, non-negotiable sentence: professional death. The cost of calling me Wallpaper was not just his money, but his permanent expulsion from the world he believed was his birthright. His ascent had been built on fraud. His downfall was built on cold, absolute financial justice. Victor's exile to his sister's suburban home marked the end of the emotional narrative and the beginning of the final, brutal phase of the legal process. In the absence of his ego and his corporate theatrics, the divorce became what it always was meant to be: a cold, methodical asset liquidation. Victor had clung to the belief that the courts would favor the traditional 50-50 split, that the marital pot would be divided equally regardless of his actions. This belief was the last, most dangerous financial illusion he harbored, and I was prepared to shatter it with the unyielding force of forensic data. My lawyer, Maya Chen, presented the case to the family court not as a typical divorce, but as a defense of my financial future against the catastrophic risk imposed by Victor's criminal behavior, the key to securing the disproportionate 70-30 split. lay in redefining the nature of the marital assets and the concept of shared responsibility. We argued three critical points, each one supported by the irrefutable evidence compiled in the Black Swan dossier: marital waste and financial endangerment. We successfully argued that Victor's fraudulent corporate activities, specifically the IP theft and market manipulation that led to the SE freeze, constituted marital waste. His actions didn't just jeopardize his career, they actively risked all shared assets, exposing me to significant legal liability and future tax repercussions had the funding gone through. This egregious breach of fiduciary duty within the marriage justified a larger claim for me: disparity in employability and future earning capacity. Victor was now a federally investigated felon, permanently blacklisted from the Tier 1 financial sector as evidenced by the letters from his former corporate counsel and Arthur's firm. My career, meanwhile, was ascendant. I was an ethically clean, highly specialized forensic auditor. The court acknowledged that a 50-50th split would leave Victor financially ruined, but myself merely solvent, whereas a 70-30th split served to redress the massive, permanent disparity in his future earning capacity, a disparity he created through his crime. Clean hands doctrine, most crucially. We demonstrated that I had already acted to protect the shared estate by settling my portion of the mortgage debt using my discrete, ethically earned funds, the home maintenance fund. This action demonstrated my financial stability and responsibility, standing in stark contrast to Victor's reckless, criminal actions. The courtroom atmosphere was not one of drama, but of quiet, institutional finality. Victor was not present. He was represented by a low-cost, overworked defense attorney who could only offer meek objections. Victor's inability to secure high-caliber counselor, direct result of my Black Swan Strategy, ensured that my well-funded VHS. I've still funded VHS. If you're using like a scanner, Laban, if you're using like a scanner app and it's like, we're gonna die, like, look at this. I've still funded VDS, Unway Klong, Leclerc at Lee Day, and we all know I've been exploring that. Left Swan Strategy and / dad, while left well swanned, stad unwake / I'll rewive we left in. I see with calically walkawad. I get a quai with thc well while left confide with sevdu a caw I see we say kiss like we like to see to we you to say you I get. Meticulously researched case went virtually unchallenged. The judge, reviewing the cold clinical data of the SEC filings attached to our claim, issued the final ruling with little hesitation. The final liquidation of the penthouse and all remaining liquid assets would proceed, with 70% of the net proceeds allocated to Clara Rhodes, and 30% retained in a trust pending the resolution of Victor's federal matters. The transfer itself was silent, efficient, and irreversible. It occurred not with the crash of a gavel, but with the quiet click of funds being wired into my personal secure accounts. The penthouse, the gilded cage that had defined Victor's ambition and my silence, was sold quickly to a high-net-worth foreign buyer eager to take advantage of the quick liquidation. The closing was conducted entirely through escrow, a technical and financial transaction entirely. It's removed from Victor's physical presence or emotional input. The symbolism of the 70-30th split was profound. It wasn't just money. It was the court's definitive numerical validation of my integrity over his fraud. The law acknowledged that my contribution to the marriage, my quiet stability, my financial acumen, and ultimately, my decisive action to protect the marital estate was more valuable than his entire fraudulent career. The difference between 50% and 70% represented the quantifiable cost of his arrogance and the legal value of my self-rescue. I used the proceeds not for frivolous spending, but for the strategic final phase of my liberation. The first order of business was to purchase a new property at high-end, professionally secured studio apartment in a clean, quiet neighborhood. The transaction was structured to be entirely debt-free, a monument to my renewed financial stability. The unit was not enormous or ostentatious like the penthouse, but it was mine, ethically clean, legally sound, and wholly unburdened by Victor's toxic financial signature. The remaining capital was immediately channeled into two critical areas: educational investment. I enrolled in an accelerated, highly specialized postgraduate certification program in global financial compliance and risk management. This was not for a degree, but for the highest level of professional validation, preparing me for the Tier 1 corporate positions that demand unimpeachable integrity. Professional seed capital. I established a boutique consulting firm, Rhodes Risk Management, specializing in identifying and mitigating black swan fraud risks for large corporations. I was transitioning from an invisible auditor to a high-value sought-after security expert, monetizing the very skill set Victor had scorned. Meanwhile, Victor received the news of the 70/30th split through a formal letter delivered to Eleanor's address. The letter, devoid of any personal commentary from me, simply detailed the final allocation of funds and the schedule for the final legal dissolution. Victor's reaction to the news was not one of renewed rage, but of profound, quiet defeat. Eleanor recounted the moment to Maya, who relayed it to me with clinical detachment. Victor didn't scream or break things. He simply crumpled the letter and stared at the suburban lawn, his face a mask of total devastation. He had finally been confronted with the true cost of his hubris, quantified in the most painful possible terms. The loss of his financial dominance. He was left with 30% of the residual assets, some that, after legal fees and anticipated restitution claims from the SEC and Quantum Nexus Labs, would likely leave him with nothing but debt. His 30% was a technicality. My 70% was a foundation for a new life. The final act of the Matriarchs, in this stage, was the execution of the final separation document. This document, signed by me in my lawyer's office, affirmed my freedom and my promise to Victor. I would not pursue him for further civil action related to adultery or emotional distress. I would provide a professional reference, absolutely required. But only one sentence. Clara Rhodes affirms Victor. Vance was formerly the CEO of Ethelred Tech. The final condition, absolute and permanent, cessation of all contact. The silent transfer was complete. The money was wired, the papers were signed, and the door to Victor's old life was welded shut with the unyielding coldness of legal finality. The man who scoffed at my financial capacity was now dependent on the meager charity of others. While the Wallpaper was funding her own multi-million-dollar future, the 70/30th split was the final, non-negotiable proof that integrity always trumps fraud. The legal gavel that ratified the 70/30th split was not merely the end of a destructive marriage. It was the starting gun for my true, unburdened professional life. The silent transfer of funds into my accounts marked the final conversion of Victor's fraud into my future security. The money was clean, ethically earned, and entirely free of the toxic signature he had tried to impose upon me. My focus shifted instantly from legal defense to strategic professional offense. The first profound act of liberation was the procurement of my new office space. It wasn't a sprawling corporate headquarters, but a high-end, dedicated executive suite in a prominent downtown Tawara space that commanded respect and offered a panoramic, clean view of the city Victor now viewed only from a suburban window. This office was more than real estate. It was the physical manifestation of my integrity and my freedom. The suite was minimalist, bathed in natural light, and equipped with the highest level of security and forensic technology. Its most valuable asset, however, was the view. It looked directly over the cluster of gleaming skyscrapers that housed the SEC regional office and the former headquarters of Ethelred Tech. I hadn't chosen the view for nostalgia or spite. I chose it for the constant, quiet reminder that I was now operating on a higher ethical and professional plane than the one Victor had tried to trap me in. I had traded the gilded cage of debt and pretense for the clear, unburdened air of financial and intellectual autonomy. My former skills as a forensic auditor had been my hidden strength. Now they became my monetized expertise. I launched Rhodes Risk Management, specializing in identifying the very black swan financial fraud risks that had brought down Victor. My niche was instantly valuable. Corporations, terrified by the speed of Evelyn Tech's implosion, were desperate for preventative measures. My credentials were impeccable: a maintained CPA, advanced certifications in global compliance, and the unspoken credibility of having navigated a high-stakes corporate fraud investigation cleanly. The financial world didn't need to know the details of my divorce. They simply needed to know that my internal audit of Evelyn Tech was the source of the successful intervention. The effect of my action, the immediate, definitive exposure of fraud, was my most powerful marketing tool. I wasn't looking for clients. I was selecting partners. I began by targeting mid-sized, rapidly growing tech firms eager to avoid Victor's fate, offering them forensic integrity, audits a cold, ruthless assessment of their financial structure designed to expose internal weaknesses before regulators ever saw them. My rates were premium, reflecting the rarity of my specialized expertise. The demand was immediate and overwhelming. The true victory was the profound transformation in my daily routine. My days were no longer defined by Victor's erratic schedule or my role as expensive wallpaper. They were structured by complex, intellectually demanding work, engaging with boardrooms, legal teams, and compliance officers who treated me with the utmost respect. I was no longer the quiet wife. I was Clara Rhodes, the essential risk mitigation expert. This professional ascent was accelerated by my strategic educational investment. I immersed myself in the Global Financial Compliance Postgraduate Certification, not for the diploma, but to integrate the latest regulatory frameworks into my firm's methodology. My firm's intellectual product was defined by its proactive adherence to future law, ensuring my clients were always operating ahead of the curve Victor had tried to hide behind. I intentionally hired a small, highly specialized team: a lead IT security analyst, Mark, my former colleague, and a senior corporate legal researcher. I built a firm based on the values Victor had discarded: integrity, meticulous detail, and a complete intolerance for compromise. The atmosphere in my new office was clean, focused, and humming with the energy of genuine ethical achievement. The only sound was the clicking of specialized keyboards and the low, confident hum of productive business calls. Meanwhile, Victor's existence was the opposite: a daily slow-motion exercise in humiliation. He was trapped in the quiet despair of his sister's suburban home, forced to take a low-paying menial job in a warehouser, whirled away from the C-suite he believed was his birthright. His back ached, his hands were calloused, and his only professional interactions were with shift managers who viewed him as an unreliable, entitled worker. He was still occasionally contacted by Maya Chen, my lawyer, but only to finalize the financial disposition, each call a painful, legal reminder of his dwindling net worth. His only remaining financial assets were tied up in the trust, subject to future restitution claims. He was effectively financially frozen in place, unable to advance his life while I was surging forward. The physical separation was symbolic. While Victor was forced to commute on public transport, reading the financial news that detailed the dismantling of his former company, I was ascending to the C-suite offices of major corporations, hired to prevent the next Black Swan. His downfall was the ethical proof of my competence. One afternoon, standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of my new office, looking down on the expansive city, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. The view was no longer a representation of shared ambition. It was a clear, unencumbered perspective of my own singular, hard-won success. I reflected on Victor's final arrogant taunt: "I'll handle the money. You just handle the house." He thought the division of labor was a statement of his dominance. In the end, he lost the money and the house, while I had successfully managed both. I managed the marital assets into a 70% share, and I handled the house by building a new unbreakable foundation for my life, a foundation built on professional integrity. not borrowed wealth. The ultimate measure of my triumph was not the bank balance, but the internal shift in power. Victor had spent years trying to control my worth and suppress my intelligence. Now, I controlled the narrative of his downfall, and my intelligence was the single most valuable asset I possessed. The Matriarch's will had been executed flawlessly. I turned away from the panoramic window, picked up my briefcase, and headed to a meeting with the board of directors of a major global entity, who were waiting respectfully in the lobby. My life was no longer reactive. It was proactive, powerful, and defined entirely by my own making. Years passed, measured not by the seasons, but by the escalating success of Rhodes, risk management, and the deepening legal woes of Victor Vance. The narrative of his downfall was now firmly written in the public record. The former CEO, once lauded for his visionary ambition, was officially branded a financial pariah, facing civil suits from former investors and the persistent, cold scrutiny of the SEC. The Black Swan Strategy was complete, and its consequences were irreversible. While I flourished in the intellectual freedom of my new C-suite life, Victor's existence was a study in perpetual grinding humiliation. He remained trapped in the quiet despair of his sister Eleanor's home, unable to rebuild because his foundation, his reputation, his perpetuation, and his capacity for trust was permanently compromised. He was the living, walking embodiment of a catastrophic audit failure. The price of status for Victor was absolute. He had valued the veneer of wealth over the substance of integrity. And the financial world had exacted its final brutal payment. His entire identity had been constructed on the foundation of Evelyn Tech's fraudulent valuation. Once that valuation collapsed, the man underneath had nothing left. He was now forced to perform menial labor, his once manicured hands scarred and calloused by tasks he considered beneath him. Tasks that provided just enough income to satisfy the courts that he was contributing something, yet not enough to ever escape his debt. I received periodic, necessary updates from Maya Chen regarding his legal status. The pattern was always the same. Restitution was being paid to Quantum Nexus Labs from his frozen trust, and the remainder of his 30% asset allocation was steadily being consumed by legal fees for a defense that could never succeed. He was caught in an economic vortex, pulling him inevitably toward complete financial zero. The true defeat for Victor was not the loss of the money, but the loss of his name. His professional identity, Victor Vance, had become synonymous with fraud. No amount of money could ever cleanse that stain. He was professionally neutralized, doomed to the permanent purgatory of the expatriate of high finance, forced to live by the quiet, ethical standards he had spent his youth mocking. This was the profound, cold justice of the Matriarch's will. I had ensured that the man who believed he was above all rules was finally subjected to the strictest, most unforgiving rule of the financial universe. Accountability is absolute, in stark contrast. My life was a definitive testament to the power of integrity and competence. Rhodes Risk Management became a success story in the compliance sector, built on the reputation of being the firm that could see what others missed. I was the keynote speaker at major financial conferences, lecturing on the very vulnerabilities Victor exploited: the Cyprus maneuver, the Venezuelan receivable. My expertise was born from personal trial, and that authenticity was my greatest asset. I was respected, sought after, and universally valued. The conversations I now had were not superficial domestic exchanges. They were complex, high-level discussions with leaders who recognized that I possessed a unique, indispensable clarity. I had successfully traded my silence for my voice, and my decorative role for one of definitive, decisive authority. The ultimate measure of my triumph was the profound, enduring inner peace I discovered. I felt no residual anger toward Victor, only a cold, complete indifference. Anger requires engagement. Indifference implies total closure. I had spent years of my life seeking validation and love from a man incapable of giving either. Now I generated my own validation through my work and my independence. I had found my power not in dominating others, but in mastering myself. I learned that the true financial security is not held in bank accounts, but in an unbreakable skill set and an uncompromising character. These two assets are immune to market crashes, infidelity, and legal challenges. Victor had lost his character. I had found mine. The emotional wound of the betrayal had been cauterized and replaced by the solid, unyielding foundation of my professional identity. I was no longer a victim seeking justice. I was the matriarch enforcing the standard of justice for my own life. The true final lesson of the Black Swan Strategy unfolded one crisp autumn morning. Months after the divorce was finalized, I was attending a high-profile industry summit, being honored for my contributions to corporate ethics. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the powerful, respectful audience, I realized the ultimate separation between Victor and myself. He chased the illusion of status, the expensive suit, the extravagant gifts, the arrogant name. He sought a shortcut to the summit of success, building his path on fraud and deceit. I chose the slow, difficult path of substance and integrity. I built my power through rigorous education, quiet competence, and the refusal to compromise my ethical core, even when it meant enduring humiliation. Victor lost his name because it was a false currency. I found my power because it was an authentic asset. I concluded my address with a quote that served as my final, unspoken message to the man who once called me Wallpaper. The system of finance is not cruel. It is merely an unforgiving mirror. It reflects precisely the integrity you bring to it. If you build your house on lies, the system will not hesitate to expose the fraudulent foundation. It will demand that you pay the price for status, which is always the total cost of your deception. My life was now defined by forward movement, new partnerships, new challenges, and new heights of achievement. Victor's life was defined by endless retrospection, the regret, the debt, and the permanent stain on his name. He was forever looking back at the beautiful penthouse that was once his. While I was building the next generation of financial protection, the matriarch's will had proven its final, profound truth. Power is not what you possess, but what you control. Victor controlled nothing but his own downfall. I controlled my narrative, my financial future, and the unwavering integrity that would ensure my permanent freedom. The wallpaper was gone, replaced by the architect of her own destiny.